Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Sound of the First Glance. The rain began to fall as a soft whisper, tapping against the windows of the crowded cafe. Inside, the air was thick with the rich scent of freshly ground coffee, mingling with the hum of hushed conversations and the clinking of ceramic mugs. It was the kind of afternoon where time seemed to slow down, where the world outside seemed far away, and everything inside was warm and enveloping. The kind of afternoon where you could lose yourself in a moment without realizing you were doing it. I was sitting by the window, staring out at the blurred streets, trying to block out the noise of the world and the thoughts swirling in my head. I wasn't usually the kind of person who went to cafes to reflect or be alone in public. It was always a bit too noisy for my liking. But today was different. I had a sort of emptiness I couldn't quite place, a quiet ache in my chest, and I thought maybe this place might help drown it out. My fingers traced the rim of my coffee cup, the surface rippling slightly with the movement. I was lost in thought when I first saw him. It wasn't that I noticed him right away, but rather that his presence seemed to fill the space before I even knew he was there. He entered the cafe with the quiet grace of someone who belonged, yet there was a hint of something uncertain about him. He stood for a moment at the door, eyes scanning the room, almost like he was searching for something or someone. His hair was dark, messy in a way that suggested he didn't care too much about how it looked, and his jacket, a simple black leather one, was just rugged enough to make him seem intriguing. He moved through the room with a kind of ease that made it hard to believe anyone could be as confident as he appeared. But as his eyes caught mine, just for a split second, something shifted. There was a moment of stillness just between us, as though the world around us paused. His gaze held mine for just long enough to make me wonder if he had known me from somewhere, if our paths had crossed before. I couldn't look away, and neither could he. The feeling was brief, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. He sat down at the table opposite me, almost too casually, as though we were both part of some unspoken script that had been written without our knowledge. I tried not to make it obvious that I had noticed him, but I could feel the tension between us, like the space between us had grown narrower in an instant. He opened his book, though his eyes barely seemed to move over the pages. I couldn't help but watch him, trying to make sense of the strange connection I felt. His jaw was strong, his lips just slightly curved, and when he looked up from his book, his eyes met mine again. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice a soft rasp, the kind that could pull you in even if you didn't want to be. I blinked, surprised by the question, and shook my head, my voice betraying me as I spoke. "I don't think so." He gave me a small, knowing smile, and for some reason it felt like he was playing some sort of game, one I didn't quite understand. "Strange," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. "You look familiar." The words lingered in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I wasn't sure what he meant by them, but they stirred something in me, an unsettling feeling that I couldn't quite name. He went back to his book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over yet. And, in a strange way, I didn't want it to be. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the world outside had grown even darker, and the quiet between us had deepened. Every time I glanced at him, it felt like he was just on the edge of something, like he was waiting for me to say something to fill the silence between us. But I couldn't bring myself to speak. My thoughts were scattered, too many questions swirling in my mind. And then, just as I was beginning to believe the moment had passed, he closed his book and leaned forward slightly, his gaze more intense now, as though he had made a decision. "I don't know what it is about you," he said, his voice softer than before, but still filled with something I couldn't define. "But there's something about you that feels different." I wanted to reply, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. It was more like I couldn't quite grasp the nature of what he was implying. It was as though he could see something in me that no one else could, something I wasn't sure I even understood. Before I could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and a gust of cold wind swept through the room. For a moment, everything was a blur of motion, people shifting in their seats, adjusting their scarves, and pulling their coats tighter. I turned my head, momentarily distracted by the scene. When I looked back, he was gone. I blinked, my heart suddenly racing in a way I couldn't explain. His chair was empty. The book was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, without so much as a trace. I glanced around the room, but there was no sign of him. No lingering presence, no shadow of the person who had been sitting across from me just moments ago. I stood up quickly, my legs unsteady, as if I had just woken up from a dream. I rushed to the door, pushing it open with an urgency I couldn't understand. But there was nothing outside. No one. Only the rain, which had grown heavier, falling in thick sheets against the sidewalk. I didn't know what to make of what had happened. All I knew was that, somehow, everything had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. Weeks later, when I returned to the cafe, I asked the barista about the man who had been sitting across from me that day. The barista gave me a puzzled look, as if I had asked about a ghost. "We don't get many regulars around here," she said, her tone almost apologetic. "And I don't recall anyone like that." My chest tightened. Was it all a figment of my imagination? A trick my mind had played on me? Or had something truly inexplicable happened? As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something on the table, just under the light. It was a small, folded piece of paper, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling. Written in delicate, neat handwriting was a single line: "We were never meant to meet again." And that, more than anything, left me wondering. Chapter 2: The Unwritten Letter. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to move past that moment, the strange encounter at the cafe, but every time I closed my eyes I saw him, his dark eyes meeting mine, the hint of a smile, the soft sound of his voice that felt like it belonged in a dream. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental in the way I viewed the world, as though the ordinary had been touched by something extraordinary. The note, tucked away in my coat pocket, never left my thoughts. We were never meant to meet again. The words had haunted me, spinning around in my mind, over and over again. What did they mean? Why had he written them? And who was he, really? Was he a figment of my imagination, a person who existed only in the confines of that brief encounter, or was there more to this than I understood? I went back to the cafe the next day, not expecting anything, but hoping for something. Anything. The barista was there again, her face neutral as she handed me my usual coffee. I tried to ask about the man, but all she could tell me was the same thing as before. No one like him had been in the cafe. No one had left a note. I felt ridiculous. Perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a fleeting moment, a trick of the mind, some delusion brought on by the stormy weather or the loneliness I'd been feeling lately. But there was something in my gut that told me it was real. It wasn't just a random encounter. It was too significant to be brushed aside. Days turned into weeks, and life continued, as life tends to do. I tried to put the memory of him behind me. I focused on school, on the people I knew, on the simple rhythms of my daily routine. But every so often, that nagging feeling would return, and I would find myself back at the cafe, searching the faces of the people around me, hoping to see him again. It was one rainy evening, just as I was finishing a project late into the night, that I received the letter. It came in the form of a small, unmarked envelope, slipped under my door with no return address. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, the same delicate strokes, the same careful loops. I tore open the envelope, barely able to steady my hand, and unfolded the note inside. The story is not finished. No name. No explanation. Just that one cryptic sentence, as if he were speaking to me through time and space. I could feel my pulse quicken as I held the paper in my hands. It felt like a message, a call, something meant only for me. I sat down on the couch, the weight of the note sinking into my chest. It was as if the universe was telling me that I couldn't escape whatever this was, that I had to follow it, even if I didn't understand it. I had no choice but to go back to the cafe. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to know more. I had to see him again. The cafe was empty when I arrived, the usual crowd of regulars absent. The air felt colder than usual, the shadows longer, as though the place itself was waiting for something to happen. I sat at the same table by the window where it had all begun and waited. An hour passed, and nothing. The barista, a young man I hadn't seen before, was busy wiping down tables. I thought about leaving, about giving up on this wild goose chase. But then, just as I was about to get up, the door opened. A man walked in. Not the same man, but someone who carried the same energy, the same quiet certainty. He wasn't the same, but I could feel it in my bones. He was connected to the one who had sat across from me that day. My heart raced. He looked around the cafe for a moment before his eyes met mine. There was no recognition in his expression, but there was a sense of familiarity, like we were part of the same story without having to say a word. He walked toward me, slowly, deliberately, until he was standing in front of the table. "Do you know him?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with an unfamiliar intensity. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The question made no sense. I didn't know who he was referring to, who he was, or what he was talking about. "Who?" I asked, my voice betraying my confusion. "The man you were with," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The one who left a message for you." I felt a shiver run through me. My mind raced. "How did he know?" "I don't understand," I whispered. "Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat down across from me, his gaze intense, as if weighing my every word. "I'm someone who knows things," he said finally, his tone calm but edged with something dark. "And you're part of something bigger than you think. You've been chosen." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss him, but something in his eyes made me pause. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a game. "Chosen for what?" I managed to ask, though I had a sinking feeling that I already knew the answer. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a whisper, to finish the story. And in that moment, I realized that the encounter in the cafe, the strange connection, the note, the letters, wasn't random at all. It had been set in motion long before I'd ever stepped into that cafe. It wasn't a love story. It wasn't fate. It was something much darker, something twisted. The man who had sat across from me, the one whose eyes I would never forget, wasn't just a stranger. He was a part of a story that had been written long before we met. And I was about to find out just how deep this story went, and how much I would lose in the process. The man who had just sat down across from me wasn't just a messenger. He was a warning. And I had no idea how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth. Chapter 3. The Weight of Truth. The cafe felt different now, quieter somehow, as though the air had thickened with the weight of something unspoken. I could hardly focus on the man sitting across from me. His eyes, dark, sharp, like they could see right through me, kept pulling my attention back to him, like gravity. His words hung in the air, and I couldn't shake them. "You've been chosen." I tried to steady my breath, but my heart was hammering in my chest, a nervous rhythm I couldn't control. Chosen for what? The question bounced around in my mind, echoing louder with every second. "You still don't understand," the man said, his voice low but insistent. "This wasn't random. You and him, the one you're searching for, you're part of something much bigger. And now you have a choice." I stared at him, trying to make sense of the confusion swirling in my mind. I had so many questions, but none of them felt like they mattered. All I could do was sit there, frozen, waiting for him to explain. But he didn't. Instead, he slid a small folded piece of paper across the table to me. It was the same as the one I had received before, neatly written, crisp. I took it, my fingers trembling. This time, the handwriting was different, but it still felt familiar, as though it belonged to someone I was supposed to know. I unfolded it slowly. The words inside were short, but the meaning behind them was enough to send a chill through my spine. The end is near. There are no more choices. The blood drained from my face. I looked up at the man, my eyes wide with disbelief. What does this mean? Who is he? He didn't answer immediately, but instead leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as if evaluating my every reaction. "The man you're looking for, the one who left you the first note, he's not who you think he is, and neither are you." My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea what he meant, but I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine, creeping into my bones. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from falling into something dark, something that would swallow me whole. Who am I whispered, almost to myself. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's the question, isn't it? You don't know who you are, and you don't know who he is. But I can tell you this. You can't escape what's coming. The story was never finished, and you've already become part of it. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented thoughts. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. The cafe, the man, the letters, it was too surreal, too much like a bad dream. And then, as if on cue, a flash of memory jolted through me. The moment when I had first seen him, the strange man in the cafe, sitting across from me. His eyes had held something I couldn't understand then, an unreadable depth, as if he had been waiting for me, as if this encounter was inevitable. You've been waiting for me, I said, my voice cracking as the realization hit me. You've been waiting for me all along. The man didn't say anything. He only nodded, his expression unreadable. And then suddenly I felt it. A shift. It was as though the world around me had blurred, like I was being pulled into a different reality. The sound of the cafe, the clinking of cups and conversations faded into the background. I felt dizzy, unsteady, as though the very air had become heavier, suffocating. You feel it too, don't you? The man asked, his voice cutting through the haze. I nodded slowly, trying to steady myself. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the cafe itself were alive, breathing with a life of its own. Something was happening. Something I couldn't explain. Suddenly, I saw him. The man. He wasn't far away, not like before, but now he stood across the room. His back was to me, but I knew it was him. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that unshakable certainty. The man across from me, the one who had brought me here, followed my gaze, his eyes narrowing as he stood up. It's time, he said, his voice a low murmur, like he was speaking more to himself than to me. The story is moving forward now, and so are you. I stood up, my legs trembling. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get away, but something held me in place. I couldn't move. It felt like I was caught in some kind of trance, my feet glued to the floor, my body unwilling to obey my mind. The man moved toward me, his footsteps silent against the wooden floor. You don't have a choice, you know. It's already begun. Before I could respond, before I could ask what he meant, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the cafe. I was standing in a different place entirely, an abandoned street corner. The night sky stretched above me, filled with dark clouds. The air was cold, the smell of damp concrete and the faint scent of decay hanging heavy in the air. The buildings around me were old, crumbling, as if they had been forgotten by time. I spun around, trying to make sense of where I was, but there was nothing familiar. The street was empty, silent. No people, no cars, no life. Only the oppressive stillness. And then I saw him. The man. He was standing a few steps away, his back to me. But this time he wasn't alone. There were others with him, figures in the shadows, watching me with their eyes gleaming in the darkness. I could barely make out their faces, but I could feel them, their presence pressing in on me. Suffocating. You've come, he said, his voice echoing in the silence. I tried to speak, but no words came out. Fear gripped me, cold and tight. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, unable to move. This is where it ends, the man said, turning to face me fully. His eyes were no longer kind. They were empty, cold, as though they had seen too much, as though he had already witnessed the ending of the story we were all part of. You don't get to choose anymore, he whispered, taking a step closer. The final chapter is here. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever had been started long ago, whatever twisted, impossible story had led me here, was about to come to a conclusion. But it wouldn't be one I could ever escape from. The end was coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Chapter 4. The Final Choice. The air around me grew colder, sharper, as the man and the figures in the shadows closed in. My heart thundered in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to take in my surroundings. The desolate street was suffocating in its emptiness, and yet there was a sense of purpose in the stillness. The very air felt charged, like a storm was building, and I was at the eye of it. The man who had brought me here, who had pulled me into this nightmare, stepped forward, his cold eyes fixed on mine, no longer the enigmatic stranger I had once thought he was. Now there was something darker in him, something I could not ignore, I wanted to scream, to run, to escape this twisted reality, but my body refused to obey. "You've come this far," he said, his voice low, but with an edge of finality that sent a shiver down my spine. "And now you'll understand." I couldn't speak. The words felt lodged in my throat, choking me. I wanted to ask why. Why me? Why this? Why now? But the question seemed pointless. There was something so final about the way he said understand, as if all of my doubts and confusion would be cleared away, but at a price. The shadows around me shifted, and I realized they weren't just standing there watching. They were waiting. Waiting for something. For me. One of the figures moved closer, stepping out from the darkness. He was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but there was something in the way he moved that made me instinctively take a step back. He was a part of this, whatever this was. "You have a choice," the man spoke again, his eyes locking onto mine, drawing me in. "A choice that will determine everything. The end of the story. The end of your journey." My mind was reeling. "What choice?" I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "What are you talking about?" The man smiled, a cold, twisted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "To stay and accept your fate. Or to leave, to turn away from it all. But there is no escape, not really. The story has already been written." For a brief moment I felt a flicker of something inside me. Anger, fear, defiance. "I don't want to be part of this," I muttered, more to myself than to him. The man's expression softened, as though he were almost pitying me. "You've already been drawn in. There's no way out now, but you can decide how the story ends." Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, lifting their hood. It was him. The man I had first met, the one who had vanished, leaving only a trail of cryptic messages, the one who had brought me here in the first place. His eyes met mine, and the recognition hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't fate. It was something darker, something preordained. He had always known what would happen. He had always known that I would come to this place. "You knew," I whispered, a tremor in my voice. "You knew this was going to happen." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze seemed distant, almost mournful. "I didn't want this for you," he said, his voice softer now, as though he were confessing something. "But you were never supposed to walk away from this. You were never meant to leave, and neither was I." "What do you mean?" I asked, confusion and dread fighting for control of my thoughts. He stepped closer, his face just inches from mine. There was no warmth in his touch as he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, a coldness in his fingertips that seeped into my skin, chilling me to the bone. "I've been part of this longer than you know," he said quietly. "I was the first, and now it's your turn to finish it. To finish what we started together." His words cut through the fog in my mind, leaving behind a sharp, unbearable clarity. I could feel it now, the pull, the sense of inevitability. This wasn't some twisted game. This wasn't a story that could be rewritten or escaped. It was a cycle, an unbroken chain that had begun long before I even knew. "You were never just a participant," he continued, his voice filled with a strange, sad certainty. "You were always meant to be the ending, the final chapter. The story has always been about you." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. Everything, the cafe, the notes, the man across from me, the strange feeling that had never left, had been leading up to this moment. I had been a character in a story I hadn't chosen, a story that had already been written before I even stepped onto the page. The street around us seemed to close in tighter, the walls of reality thinning. The figures in the shadows were waiting, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. And I knew that I was running out of time. The man who had once sat across from me in the cafe stepped back, allowing the shadows to close in, to envelop me. "You have your choice," he said, his tone calm and resigned. "Stay, and you'll be free. Or leave, and everything will fall apart. The end, the truth, it all lies in your hands now." I stood there trembling, every part of me screaming to run. But I knew that if I turned my back on this moment, if I walked away, everything would collapse. Everything would be lost. The figure in the shadows, the one who had been waiting all this time, stepped forward again, this time closer, almost as if it were calling to me. And as it moved into the light, I saw something that stopped me cold. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just another figure. It was me. The reflection of myself, but not quite. This version of me was different, worn, older, with a face that held years of suffering and defeat. It was like looking into a broken mirror, seeing what I could become if I didn't make the right choice. The reflection smiled at me, and that smile was the last thing I saw before everything around me went dark. When I woke, I was no longer on the street. I was back in the cafe, the familiar hum of the place around me. But everything felt wrong. It felt hollow, like the place had been drained of its life, its warmth. And sitting across from me, his eyes full of something I couldn't name, was the man. "I never wanted this for you," he said softly, his gaze locked on mine. "But now, it's over. You've chosen." My heart thudded in my chest as I realized the truth. I wasn't in control. I never had been. This wasn't my story to tell. I had only been a player in a game that was much bigger than I could ever comprehend. And as I looked into his eyes, I understood. The ending had already been decided. Final chapter. The last page. I felt the weight of his gaze on me, cold and heavy, as the realization sank in like a stone in the pit of my stomach. The man sitting across from me wasn't a stranger anymore. He wasn't an enemy. He was a part of this story, just like me. And I had always been a part of it, trapped within the confines of a narrative that had already been written from the very moment I had stepped into that cafe. Everything felt surreal now. The world around me, once filled with the sounds and smells of the cafe, had fallen silent. The clinking of cups, the soft chatter of patrons, the music playing in the background, they were all gone, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Only he and I remained alone in this hollow space. "You knew," I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely audible. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I knew all along. This was always meant to happen." "But why me?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Why did I have to be part of this? Why was I brought into this? Into your story?" He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Because you were never supposed to have a choice. This is the way it was always going to end. You were always going to be the one to bring it to its conclusion." The words hit me like a slap. My chest ached with a mixture of frustration, fear, and something darker, something that felt like the last remnants of hope being snuffed out. "But why?" I repeated, almost pleading. "Why not him? Why not you?" He sighed, his expression softening for just a moment. "Because I was the one who started it all, and you were the one who was supposed to finish it. The ending, your ending, was always written in the stars. It just took time for you to see it." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to lash out, to escape from this prison of fate. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, frozen, as the gravity of his words crushed me. "You've been a part of this from the beginning," he continued. "The cafe, the notes, the chance encounters, they weren't random. They were all pieces of the puzzle that had been set in motion long before you even stepped into that world." I looked at him, my eyes wide. So much had happened, so much I couldn't explain, so much I had tried to fight against. But now, in this final moment, it all made sense. It was never about me finding answers. It was never about me escaping or even making choices. It was always about me playing my part. The cafe, the man who had first sat across from me, the stranger who had left the notes, the figure who had haunted my every thought, they were all part of this greater design. A design that had woven itself into my life, one step at a time, until there was no way out. No way to rewrite the story. I swallowed hard, the taste of defeat bitter in my mouth. "What happens now?" He smiled then, but it wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't a comforting one. It was a smile of finality, of inevitability. "Now, you finish the story," he said softly, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. And as I sat there looking at him, I understood. The ending had already been written. There was nothing I could do to change it. The choices I thought I had, the control I thought I had all been illusions. I was merely the last piece of a puzzle, the last page of a book that had already been closed. The cafe around us began to fade, the walls thinning, the space growing darker and smaller, until only the two of us remained in that void. "You're the one who will decide," he said, almost gently now, "how this ends. You always were. You just didn't know it." I didn't want to know what he meant. I didn't want to accept that this twisted, hopeless game was the only reality I had left. But as the last remnants of the cafe vanished into darkness, and I stood there facing the man who had orchestrated it all, I realized there was nothing left to fight. The ending was here, and I was the one who had to face it. There was no escaping it, no rewriting it. The final chapter was already upon me, and I was about to step into it, whether I wanted to or not. The story of my life, the story of this game, had ended, and just like that, the world went silent. I opened my eyes again, but this time there was no cafe, no man, no story, only a blank page. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter. It was the kind of day that seemed to have been crafted by an artist, the sun hanging high in the sky with a golden warmth that kissed the skin, the breeze soft and gentle as it carried the faint scent of jasmine. Eleanor had always loved afternoons like this in the city of Cambridge, where history was alive in the ancient buildings and the air seemed to hum with the promise of something magical. She sat on the steps of the old library, a book in her lap, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the pages. Her thoughts weren't on the words in the book, but on the rhythm of the world around her. People moved like a river, flowing in and out of her vision, some in conversation, others lost in their own worlds. She liked this, observing life without fully participating, keeping her distance. That was until she saw him. He was standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost as if the world had paused just for him. His eyes, a striking shade of green, seemed to catch hers without effort, drawing her in. He wasn't anything extraordinary in the traditional sense, tall, dark hair, casually dressed, but there was something about him that made her heart skip a beat. He held her gaze for a moment, and then, as if realizing something, he stepped forward, crossing the street with a purposeful stride. Eleanor quickly averted her eyes, pretending to be engrossed in her book, though her pulse quickened. She had never been the type to get swept up in moments like these, but there was an undeniable pull, something magnetic in the air between them. When she finally glanced up, he was standing in front of her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, with a hint of an accent that Eleanor couldn't place. "I don't usually do this, but I couldn't help but notice you from across the street. Do you mind if I join you?" She hesitated. There was something intriguing about him, but the cautious side of her brain screamed to maintain her distance. Yet there was also a small voice that whispered to her, urging her to let go, to take a risk. With a small, almost reluctant smile, she nodded. "Sure, why not?" she said, surprising even herself with how easily the words came. He sat down beside her, a comfortable silence settling between them for a moment. Eleanor could feel the heat of his presence beside her, though they didn't touch. She glanced at him sideways, noticing the way his jawline was sharp, his features finely chiseled, almost as if they were made to be admired. His eyes, however, were what fascinated her most, pale green and intense, as though they could see right through her. "I'm Vincent," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "And you are?" "Elena," she replied, turning slightly towards him, her curiosity piqued. She had a million questions. Where was he from? What brought him here? But she didn't ask any of them. Instead, they simply exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the city, and the usual small talk. But beneath the surface of casual conversation, there was an unmistakable tension, a sense that something bigger was unfolding, something neither of them could yet name. As the hours passed, they wandered through the city, exploring its hidden corners, discovering places Eleanor had never noticed despite living here for years. They laughed at nothing in particular, shared stories about their lives, his being full of travels, his family, and a life that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Eleanor, on the other hand, shared the quiet details of her life, her love for books, her passion for art, and her desire to find something more than just the ordinary. When they finally stopped at a cafe, their conversation shifted to more personal territory, the kind of exchange that made her heart race. She found herself telling him things she hadn't shared with anyone in years. It was strange. He wasn't even someone she knew, but somehow it felt easy to trust him. Perhaps it was the way he listened, his full attention always on her, never distracted. But just as the conversation seemed to be reaching a deeper level, he fell silent. Vincent leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning distant. There was a strange sadness that suddenly clouded his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before, Eleanor felt a chill run through her, as if something had shifted, something had changed. "I have to go," he said suddenly, breaking the moment. His voice was quiet, almost regretful. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of his departure. "What? Where are you going?" Vincent stood up, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry, I can't explain right now, but I'm glad we met." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there. Eleanor sat frozen for a moment, staring after him, feeling an odd emptiness settle in her chest. What had just happened? She couldn't make sense of it. She had just met him, but it felt as if they had known each other for a lifetime. And now he was gone, just as suddenly as he had appeared. She stood up, feeling the weight of his absence like a physical ache, and began to walk back to her apartment, her mind racing. What had he meant by those last words? Why had he left so suddenly? There was something about the entire encounter that felt wrong, yet undeniably meaningful. It wasn't until she arrived at her apartment, ready to close the door behind her, that she noticed something strange. A small envelope was resting on her doormat. It was unmarked, no name or address, just her. She bent down and picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with just 3 words written on it. "You were never real." Chapter 2. The Revelation. Eleanor stared at the note in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The words seemed to blur in front of her eyes, the ink shifting as if mocking her, playing tricks on her mind. "You were never real." She read the phrase over and over, but it only made less sense with each passing second. She felt an icy chill creep through her veins, as if the warmth of the day had been sucked away in an instant, leaving her standing in the cold. Her apartment felt suddenly too small, too suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around her. She dropped the note onto the table, her fingers still trembling, and paced back and forth. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of twisted joke, a prank by a friend, or perhaps even a coincidence. But the more she thought about it, the less likely any of those explanations seemed. She grabbed her phone, her fingers pressing the screen with urgency. She tried to call Vincent, but his number was no longer in her contacts. She could have sworn she had saved it. They had exchanged numbers just hours ago. But now, it was as if he had never existed at all. Panicked, Eleanor opened her messages, scrolling through the conversation they had shared that afternoon. The cheerful texts they had exchanged, the pictures they had sent of the places they visited, all gone. Every trace of him had vanished, wiped from her phone like it had never been there. Her mind raced as she sat down on the couch, her breath shallow, the world outside her apartment window blurring into a hazy fog. She felt disconnected, as though the ground beneath her was giving way. You were never real. Was she losing her mind? But the note? It couldn't be a hallucination. She had picked it up herself, felt the weight of the paper in her hands. Suddenly a thought struck her. A memory, faint but sharp in her mind. She remembered walking past the old bookstore earlier that day, seeing Vincent standing there for the first time, his eyes catching hers across the street. But something about it now seemed off. Eleanor jumped up from the couch, a sense of urgency pulling her towards the door. She grabbed her coat and rushed outside, the crisp night air biting at her skin as she ran down the street towards the bookstore. She had to find answers. She had to know what was going on. As she neared the familiar building, she slowed down, her footsteps faltering. The shop was dark, its windows covered with thick curtains. It hadn't been like this when she had passed earlier. She pressed her hand to the glass, staring through the darkened windows. Something inside her stirred, a sense of familiarity, but also a deep unease. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden noise making her jump. She pulled it out quickly, hoping for some sort of confirmation or explanation. The screen lit up with a single text message. "Meet me at the old library. Midnight. Don't be late." The message was from an unknown number. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, the streets now deserted, the silence broken only by the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. When she reached the library, she noticed the door was ajar, as though someone had been waiting for her. She stepped inside cautiously, the cool air inside the building sending a shiver down her spine. The grand hall stretched before her, the tall shelves of books looming like ancient guardians. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. She walked deeper into the library, her eyes scanning the rows of books, searching for any sign of Vincent. The silence was suffocating, and Eleanor felt like she was being watched, though there was no one around. She could almost hear her own heartbeat, a steady thump in the quiet. "Eleanor?" The voice was faint, a whisper that seemed to come from all around her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows, was Vincent. His green eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his face as unreadable as ever. "You've been looking for answers," he said, his voice calm, but there was something hollow in it, something distant. "I suppose I owe you an explanation." Eleanor took a step back, her mind reeling. "What's going on? Why is everything changing? Why do I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality?" Vincent stepped forward, his expression softening, as though he felt pity for her confusion. "Because none of this is real," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "You never were. I'm not even supposed to be here." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to speak, to demand more answers, but the words caught in her throat. She felt as though she was drowning in an ocean of disbelief. "What do you mean?" she managed to whisper. Vincent reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver pendant, dangling it in front of her. It was an intricate design with a symbol she didn't recognize. "This is where it all began," he said softly. "You were never meant to exist outside the walls of this library. You were a creation, a part of a story, and now the story is ending." Eleanor's mind raced. "A creation? A part of a story?" she repeated, struggling to understand. "But how can I not be real?" Vincent's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw something like regret in his eyes. "You were a dream, Eleanor, a manifestation of someone else's memories. And now—" He trailed off, as if unsure how to finish. "Now what?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising in frustration. He closed his eyes for a moment before answering, his voice barely a whisper. "Now the story is over, and you're waking up. You were never real, Eleanor. You were only ever meant to be part of a fleeting moment, a moment that has now come to an end." Eleanor stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Everything she had believed to be true, every experience, every emotion, had been a lie, a fleeting illusion created by something she couldn't comprehend. She wasn't real. She never had been. Vincent took a step back, his face hardening. "I'm sorry. I never wanted you to know." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the library, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the cold, dark space, her world crumbling around her. Chapter 3. The Awakening. Eleanor stood in the darkened library, her body numb, her mind struggling to keep up with the revelation that had just shattered her reality. She wasn't real. She had never been real. The words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain, but no matter how much she tried to make sense of it, they refused to fit together. She didn't know how long she stood there, motionless, the silence pressing in from all sides. The cool air of the library seemed to turn colder, the space around her growing more oppressive, suffocating even. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but it felt like there was no escape. Her very existence, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a fleeting memory, a creation of someone else's mind. "Is this really how it ends?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no answer. The library remained still, its ancient shelves towering like silent witnesses to her unraveling sense of self. The pendant Vincent had shown her before, the one with the strange symbol, burned in her memory. She felt drawn to it, as if it held the key to everything. Without thinking, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled note from earlier, the one that had started this madness in the first place. Her eyes skimmed the words once more. "You were never real. Never real." It was as though something inside her clicked. Something shifted, like a door she hadn't known was there had opened. A deep, aching truth rose in her chest, and she realized that she wasn't just questioning her existence. She was on the verge of something far more dangerous, a complete and total unraveling of the very fabric of the world around her. "Wait," she muttered under her breath. "If I'm not real, then why do I remember this place? Why do I remember him? Why does it feel real? For the first time, Eleanor began to feel an inkling of something more than confusion, a flicker of power. If she wasn't real, then perhaps she had the ability to shape her own reality. Maybe, just maybe, she could rewrite the story. The thought terrified her, but it also excited her. What if she could control it? What if she could break free from the chains of whatever had created her? Could she defy the script, take control of her own destiny? With trembling hands, she stood up straighter, her mind growing more focused, more determined. She would not let Vincent's words be the end of her. She would fight this, even if she had to fight against the very nature of her existence. Suddenly, a thought struck her. Vincent. What had he meant when he said he wasn't supposed to be here? Was he part of the story too? Was he a creation like her, or was he something more? Something real? Her pulse quickened. She needed to find him. She needed answers. The library seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, but Eleanor knew that deep within its walls there was a door that led somewhere. Somewhere that could hold the answers. She began to walk, the soft echo of her footsteps bouncing off the stone walls. As she ventured deeper into the maze of bookshelves, the sense of something watching her grew stronger. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, but she refused to turn back. She was determined. Then, just as she was about to lose hope, she found it, the door. It was tucked in a shadowy corner, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. The handle was cold to the touch, and as she grasped it, a strange energy pulsed through her fingers. She could feel the door pushing back against her, testing her resolve, but she forced it open. What she saw on the other side made her breath catch in her throat. It was not a room she expected, but rather a vast, empty space that stretched endlessly in every direction. The floor was smooth, like glass, and the sky above was an unbroken expanse of swirling colors, shifting in ways that defied all logic. It was as if she had stepped into a place beyond time and space, a liminal zone where anything and everything could happen. And in the center of this endless expanse stood Vincent. He was waiting for her, as if he had known she would come. His figure was blurry at first, like a mirage, but as Eleanor stepped forward, he slowly came into focus, his familiar green eyes locking with hers. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice trembling, unsure of what she was seeing. "How is this possible? Where are we?" He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "This is where it all begins," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the vastness. "And where it ends." Eleanor's heart raced. "What do you mean? You said I wasn't real. What is this place? Why is it so empty?" Vincent's eyes darkened. "This is the space between realities, the place where all stories begin and end. You were created here, Eleanor. Not by me, not by anyone you know. You were a story, a figment of someone's imagination. But there's more to it. You were meant to be forgotten." Eleanor felt a pang in her chest, the truth of his words sinking in like a dagger. "I was supposed to be forgotten?" she repeated, barely able to comprehend. "Why?" "Because the stories need to end," Vincent replied, his tone soft but resolute. "And every story that doesn't follow the script risks unraveling everything. You were never meant to remember. But now that you do." He trailed off, his gaze turning distant. Eleanor could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. "What happens now?" she asked, a part of her already fearing the answer. Vincent looked at her for a long moment, as though he was weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, "Now, you have a choice. You can go back to the way things were. Forget all of this. Let yourself fade into the nothingness you were meant to become, or—" He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Or you can choose to stay. But if you do, you'll be rewriting the story. You'll be the author now. And that means everything you know, everything you've ever known, will cease to exist." Eleanor's mind reeled, the weight of the decision almost unbearable. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be more than she was, but now that she had the power, the choice seemed impossible. "Do I even have a choice?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Or is this just part of the story too?" Vincent didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "Your choice is yours to make, Eleanor. Just know this, some stories are better left unfinished." The space around them seemed to pulse with energy, a swirling mass of possibilities. Eleanor stood at the crossroads of her existence, the decision hanging heavy in the air. And then, for the first time, she understood. She was not just a character, she was something more. A force, a being capable of changing everything. She wasn't bound by the script. She could write her own ending. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped forward, her resolve solidifying. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I'll rewrite this story. I'll make my own ending." As she spoke, the universe seemed to shift, the colors in the sky intensifying, the very fabric of reality bending to her will. Chapter 4. The New Story. Eleanor stood at the threshold of her own creation, the very air around her alive with a power she had only just begun to understand. Her heart beat in rhythm with the energy pulsing through the vast expanse before her. The swirling colors above, the smooth glass-like floor beneath her feet, everything was shifting, reacting to her decision. She had chosen to stay, chosen to rewrite the story, and the world around her responded. For a moment, the vast emptiness seemed to hold its breath, as if even the very concept of reality itself was waiting for her next move. Eleanor glanced at Vincent, who watched her with an unreadable expression, his green eyes deep and full of unspoken things. His face was the same, but there was something different now. An underlying tension, a realization that perhaps he had never truly expected her to choose this path. "You chose this," he said quietly, almost to himself, his voice not just a sound, but a vibration that resonated with the space around them. "But do you understand what it means? You're not just rewriting your story, Eleanor. You're rewriting everything." Her gaze never left him, and though she was scared, terrified even, she stood firm. "I don't care. I'm done being someone else's creation. I'll make my own destiny." Vincent seemed to consider her words, the briefest flicker of something like admiration in his eyes, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her to take the center of the shifting, vast reality. The space around her swirled faster now, faster than before, as if it was waiting for her to decide how to shape it. The ground beneath her feet shimmered and rippled like water, and for a fleeting moment she thought she might fall into the swirling chaos. But she held her ground. She took a deep breath. "Okay," she murmured, not just to Vincent, but to the very space around her. "I'm going to make it right. I'm going to make it real." The words came to her as though they were being pulled from some hidden well of power inside her. She didn't know how she knew this, but she did. She was the author now. She had the power to mold this world, to shape everything in it. And the first thing she did was decide that the space around her would no longer be a void. It would be a place with structure, with meaning. Slowly, the sky shifted, darkening, forming clouds that glowed with an ethereal light. Buildings rose from the ground like ancient trees pushing through the earth, their spires reaching towards the now swirling sky. The glassy surface under her feet transformed into cobblestone streets, winding through parks, cafes, and bustling squares. People began to appear. Faces she recognized from her time in the city, but now they seemed more real, more alive than before. It wasn't just the appearance of them. It was their energy, their presence. They felt as if they had always been here, like they had always existed. Eleanor blinked as she watched the transformation. This world, her world, was becoming something beautiful, something alive. The possibilities seemed endless now. She had the power to create anything. But even as the world took shape, a gnawing doubt began to creep into her mind. She could create whatever she wanted. True. But could she control it all? Could she control what happened next? She had made the choice to stay, but the weight of her decision was already heavy. She turned back to Vincent, who hadn't moved, his expression unreadable. "Is this what you meant by rewriting everything?" she asked, the question heavy with uncertainty. "Will this world even hold together? Can I control it?" Vincent's eyes softened slightly. "You're still learning, Eleanor. You've only just begun to realize what you can do. But you can shape this world. You can make it as real as you want it to be. But remember..." His voice trailed off, becoming a whisper that carried through the air. "With creation comes the responsibility to hold it together. Be careful of what you wish for." Eleanor didn't know whether his words were meant to warn or advise, but she chose to believe that she could handle it. She had made the decision to stay, and with that came power. the power to forge a new existence. With a deep breath, she reached out into the world she had just created. The air hummed with the energy of her thoughts, and as her fingers brushed through the air, trees began to grow around her, their trunks thick and gnarled, their leaves rustling in an unseen wind. She felt her power surge again, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel what it meant to be alive, to exist in a world of her own making, a world where anything was possible. But as she continued to shape the landscape, something unexpected happened. The world she had forged began to change in ways she hadn't intended. The trees that had grown so beautifully began to twist unnaturally, their bark darkening and cracking, their branches reaching out like claws, as if they were trying to escape her control. The buildings she had formed shifted, their walls warping, their windows breaking and reforming into distorted shapes. The sky above began to darken ominously, as if something was stirring beneath the surface, something deep and ancient that she hadn't accounted for. "What's happening?" Eleanor whispered, her heart pounding. "Why is it changing like this?" Vincent stepped forward, his expression grim now. "It's the nature of the world you've created. You are not just shaping it with your mind, Eleanor. You are giving it life. It has its own will, its own desires. It will fight you if it feels threatened." Eleanor felt the cold grip of fear tighten around her chest. She had wanted to create something beautiful, something real. But now it seemed as though she had awakened something in the world she couldn't control. The trees loomed closer, the buildings twisted further out of shape, and the sky turned blood red. It felt as if the world itself was rebelling against her. "What do I do?" she cried out, looking desperately at Vincent. "You have to let go," he said softly, his voice filled with a strange sadness. "You have to stop trying to control it, or it will consume you. Some things can't be forced, Eleanor, not even by the strongest of wills." Eleanor's eyes darted around as she watched the world fall apart, and for the first time since making her choice, she felt truly powerless. She had created this world, but now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The more she struggled to control it, the more it fought back. And then a realization struck her. This was never about control. It was never about forcing the world to bend to her will. She had the power to shape, yes, but not to dictate. The world had to be allowed to grow on its own, to breathe, to live. She wasn't the creator. She was the catalyst. With a deep, steadying breath, Eleanor closed her eyes and let go. The world around her stilled. The twisting trees slowed, their branches no longer clawing at the sky. The buildings settled back into place, their walls straightening. The sky softened, the red dark clouds dispersing into the deep blues and purples of a peaceful night. When Eleanor opened her eyes again, the world was calm. It was real. It was hers, but it was more than just hers. It had its own pulse now, its own life, independent of her control. She had made it, but she had also allowed it to be. And in that balance, she found peace. Vincent, watching her, gave a small nod. "You've learned, Eleanor. You've found the true power of creation." Eleanor smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The world was hers, and it was real. Chapter 5. The Final Choice. Eleanor stood alone in the heart of the world she had created, surrounded by the lush, living landscape she had shaped with her own hands. The air was thick with possibility, the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers mingling with the sharp tang of the wind. The sky stretched out above her, vast and endless, its deep blues dotted with scattered stars, as though the universe itself was waiting for her next move. She had done it. She had created a world from nothing. But now, as she took in the beauty of her surroundings, a sense of unease settled deep in her chest. The world was alive, yes, but was it truly hers? Or had she just replaced one illusion with another? Vincent stood beside her, his presence quieter now, more solemn than before. His green eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something like regret in them, an emotion she had never thought him capable of. "You've done it, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You've created a world, but now you have to face the consequences." Eleanor turned to him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? I've made it real. I've made it mine." Vincent shook his head, his expression distant. "It's not just about making something real, it's about what happens when you give life to something. You can't control it anymore. The world will grow, change, evolve, just like you did. And with that comes unpredictability. But I'm ready for that. I want to live with it, experience it, she said, her voice filled with conviction. This world is mine, Vincent. I'm ready to see where it takes me. He was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then he sighed, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and looked away. You don't understand yet, Eleanor. It's not just about the world. It's about you. You created this reality, but now you're part of it. Your fate is tied to it, and as it grows, so do the risks. Eleanor frowned, her stomach tightening. What risks? Vincent turned his gaze back to her, his eyes sad but knowing. The more you alter the fabric of reality, the more fragile it becomes. And there are forces out there, forces beyond this world, beyond the worlds you've seen, that want to see it undone. Your existence, the very idea of you, is a threat to them. A cold shiver ran through Eleanor. She had thought the world she had created would be an escape, an act of freedom. But now it felt more like a trap. Is that why you're here? She asked, her voice trembling. You're not just part of the story. You're here to stop me, aren't you? To stop this world from ever being real. Vincent's expression hardened, but his eyes softened. No, Eleanor, I'm here because I care. I care about you, and you need to understand that even a world of your making has consequences. You've given it life, but now it's yours to protect. And that means you have to decide what comes next. Eleanor's heart ached. She had believed that creating this world would be the answer, that it would give her the freedom she had always longed for. But now it felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. What do I do, Vincent? She whispered, feeling more lost than ever. What do I do now? He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. The choice is yours, Eleanor. You can continue to fight to protect this world you've created, to make it real in a way that nothing can tear apart. Or, he paused, his gaze darkening. Or you can let it go. Let everything you've made fade and return to the void. It's a peaceful existence, a simple one, no pain, no consequences, but you'll never know what could have been. Eleanor's mind raced, her pulse quickening. She had fought so hard to create this place, to make something real, to free herself from the chains of someone else's story. But now she had to choose between holding on to the world she had forged or letting it slip away. It was a question that had no easy answer. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a storm, darkening the skies above and causing the ground beneath her to tremble. Vincent, I don't know if I can choose, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know if I can live with either choice. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to do this alone. You've always had the power, Eleanor. The world is yours to shape, and it always will be. But that also means you have the power to let it go, if that's what you choose. Neither choice is wrong, but you have to make it for yourself. Eleanor closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of it all was unbearable, the power to shape worlds, to give life to something, and yet, knowing she had to live with the consequences of that power. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She wasn't just a character in a story. She was the creator and the created. She began, her voice steadying. I think I've made my choice. She looked up at Vincent, her eyes clear now, the storm of doubt and fear subsiding. I choose to protect it. This world, my world. I'll fight for it. I'll fight to make it real, because it's mine, and it's worth the fight. Vincent's face softened, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw a smile. It wasn't a triumphant smile, but a gentle one, a quiet understanding between them. Then let it be so. The ground beneath them hummed with energy, and the world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to act. Eleanor raised her arms, and the energy of the world responded, flowing through her like a living current. She could feel the power of creation and destruction coursing through her. But this time, she didn't fight it. She embraced it. The world shifted, the sky glowing brighter, the streets bustling with life, the trees growing tall and strong. Eleanor had chosen to protect it, and with that choice she had become one with the world, no longer an outsider, no longer a mere observer. As the world settled into its new form, Vincent took a step back, his eyes filled with something unreadable. You've done it, he said softly. You've made it real, and now you can live in it. In your world. Forever. Eleanor smiled, feeling the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever would be. But it was hers. She had written this story, and now she was living it. For the first time, she felt truly free. The end.